President Takagi, Dr. Nakamai, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to have this opportunity to speak at the Sasagawa Peace Foundation, and it's a personal pleasure to look out on the audience at so many old friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for coming. Today I wanted to talk about the Japanese economy from an outsider's perspective. Let me start by saying that the period that I grew up as a junior high school student, and college student coincided with the most remarkable era of economic development in modern economic history. And it was really the story of Japan, the story of Japan's recovery from the devastation of the Pacific War and its pathway towards pace-setting rates of economic growth. Japan was the envy of the world from really 1970 through 1990, an era in which from 1955 to 1970, Japan's average growth rate was 9.5% per year. It recalls really the growth rates of China and the rapidly growing economies today. From 1971 to 1990, it slowed to 3.8 average growth rate during this period of time, thanks to the oil embargo and the maturation of the Japanese economy. And China is going to probably go through a similar slowdown as it now enters more maturity. And then from 1991 to 2011, the growth rate slowed to less than 1%, 0.8% average growth rate over 2 decades. This was an anticlimax to the story of the Japanese economic miracle. Everyone knows that Japan has one of the highest rates of public debt in the world, 230% of GDP. It has not been able over the past 2 decades to break the grip of deflationary forces. And it is, as we see in the growth rates, 0.8% growth rate over the past 2 decades, treading water and really not making the headway that it showed in the 1970s and 1980s. Population. Japan's population is aging and contracting. We all know that. The fertility rate is 1.37 per female. This means that Japan is steadily shrinking, contracting, and from 127 million Japanese today, 2012, by the middle of this century, 2050, the Japanese population, if the shrinking continues, will be 109 million. By the end of the century, the demographers predict that Japan's population will be 64 million. So from 127 million to 64 million in the course of this century. That means that every year, on average, Japan's population will shrink by 800,000 people. If you look at the industrial economy, Japan's companies, its leading edge companies, have been falling behind. In 1990, the Japanese consumer electronics companies like Sony and Panasonic were considered the great champions of consumer electronics in the world. But today, 2 decades later, Sony's market cap is $12 billion compared to Samsung, which is $160 billion, and Apple, which is $638 billion. And you see that Sony, Panasonic, sharp, they're hemorrhaging deficits and having difficulty competing in the new areas of electronics. So this has been a dramatic turnaround. There are also rigidities in Japan's labor market. And over time, we see that women, that only 48% of women in Japan participate in the labor force, which is one of the lowest figures in the OECD. For men, it's 72%. But for women, it's 48%. And not only that, but women receive 60% of the men's salary for work that is similarly done. Women occupy only 4% of CEO positions in Japan. So there are inefficiencies in the labor market. Foreign residents in Japan represent less than 2% of the Japanese population. This small percentage of foreign-born workers in the economy suggests that there are costs to this homogeneity, and one of the costs is the steady influx of high-level, high-skilled jobs or workers coming from abroad. That has been the secret of America's competitive success in entrepreneurship and innovation. Energy is another problem, and particularly after 3/11, question is, what will Japan do with nuclear energy? Will it reduce it to 15% of electricity generated, or bring it down to zero? And whatever the decision the Japanese make, it is likely to lead to higher energy costs and incentives for Japanese companies with higher energy costs to manufacture and set up overseas. And then another problem in Japan, as in other advanced industrial economies, is governance. A lack of leadership, partisan gridlock, a narrow partisan burrowing in of a partisan interest rather than national interests. And this has been a serious political problem for all industrial democracies during times of recession. There are, at the same time, extremely encouraging trends and developments. I call them economic opportunities. We are now living in what Schumpeter would call an era of creative destruction. We have a tsunami of innovation and change taking place. We have disruptive, revolutionary technologies that are changing every sector of the world economy. So there is, on the horizon, a boom in terms of technology and innovation and entrepreneurship, and Japan has an opportunity to participate in this remarkable cycle of innovation. There is also a global infrastructure boom, and it's part of this innovation boom. And as countries in the world develop, China and India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, they are developing infrastructure. Energy, transportation, healthcare, telecommunication, every segment of their infrastructure is undergoing expansion and upgrading. So this energy infrastructure is a huge, booming market, both now and in the future. Now, Japan brings into this infrastructure boom a lot of competitive assets, and so far, it has not been exported fully. There have been some exports of the technology abroad, but with the boom in infrastructure that I'm talking about, there is a tremendous opportunity for high-speed rail, for subways, for municipal transportation, many areas of transportation infrastructure for Japan to develop. Energy is another emerging areas: smart grid, smart homes, smart communities, using renewable energies to connect, to store energy, electrical vehicles, battery recharging infrastructure. Many of these areas, again, provide an opportunity for Japanese companies and Japanese technology. And again, I want to point out that Japan has superlative technology in these areas. Finally, let me say that there are deep pockets that Japan has still in its economy. In spite of the large government debt, it's estimated that Japan has maybe 12 to 15 trillion dollars of private household and corporate savings. With these deep pockets, it's possible for Japan to finance infrastructure projects, for example, and to engage in investments, infrastructure investments that I think will yield 6, 7, 8% returns over long periods of time. I believe that what Japan ought to do is first mobilize its financial resources to enter into the investment infrastructure space. And I would advocate an investment infrastructure bank, IIB, Infrastructure Investment Bank, that is partly public and partly private. With this kind of bank, Japan can offer very competitive financing for investment projects in developing countries like India. Second, I would urge Japanese companies and the Japanese government to target industrial standards as a goal for Japanese companies, not just the products, but the standards. Also, I think that it's essential for Japan to establish and build an architecture of connectivity to innovation and entrepreneurship in the United States, Silicon Valley. And I believe that some kind of architecture to build connections with Silicon Valley should be a high priority. I believe also that it is necessary for Japan to integrate fully and empower women in the workforce. A recent Goldman Sachs study suggested that if you gave equal pay for women, you might, and you allowed women equally into the workforce, there would be 8.2 million women workers coming online and a GDP growth of 15%, of $800 billion. And I believe that Japan ought to experiment with bringing highly skilled entrepreneurs and workers into the country, maybe 10,000 a year, and allowing them over a period of time to be integrated into the Japanese workforce and get Japanese citizenship. What Japan needs to do is to awake from complacency and to have a kind of commitment, a mobilization, a sense of crisis for renewal, for experimentation and adaptation, to take maximal advantage of the historic opportunities in the infrastructure. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to entertain them. My view of Japan is that it lacks leadership. It lacks vision. It lacks strategy for the collective good. It lacks centers of effective power. Like the White House in the United States is a center of effective power, whether it's exercised that way or not. And right now, when I look at Japan, I see pockets of diffuse power and no center of power. We have 3 centers of power in the United States, really 4 if you include the media, but legislative, judicial, and the White House, and so executive. So there are these power centers, but in Japan, I feel that there isn't a core of power to allow for vigorous, bold vision and leadership. Maybe with difficult times, there'll be some consolidation of power, and maybe there'll be some greater focus on really what Japan needs. And those needs will be painful. They will require sacrifices from the Japanese people. And the politicians have to tell the truth to the Japanese people. That type of leadership, I just don't know whether it's going to come into existence. But yes, I think we have a very a deficiency of leadership, political leadership in all industrial states.